We are back again tonight with the Great Airport Mystery. Chapter 6, Aerial Mission. The meteorologist at the airport says it should be clear tomorrow, Frank announced as he put the telephone down. I'll call Ace Air Service first thing in the morning and arrange to schedule an airplane, said Mr. Hardy. What time do you boys want to take off? We plan to photograph the wooded area with our aerial camera, Frank answered. If we arrive there shortly after 12 o'clock, the sun will be almost directly overhead. There won't be any shadows from trees and other objects. Good thinking, Mr. Hardy said approvingly. You'll be less likely to miss important details that might be hidden if there were shadows. The investigator said that meanwhile, he would check into the ownership of the land. If it is private property, said Joe, I doubt it belongs to that fellow who chased us. At that instant, Aunt Gertrude entered the study carrying a large tray of brownies and lemonade. She placed it on Mr. Hardy's desk. I'm sure you can all forget about your new case long enough to have a snack, she said in a cajoling voice. Frank and I have to watch what we eat, Joe said jokingly. We don't want to get airsick tomorrow. Airsick, the tall woman exclaimed, her eyes opened wider. My word! So you boys intend to go flying around in a bouncy plane? We're just going up to take some pictures of crooks, said Frank, grinning. Isn't your detective work dangerous enough here on the ground? Aunt Gertrude asked sharply. Mr. Hardy reached out and patted his sister on the shoulder. Doing detective work while flying isn't any more of a risk than it is while riding in a car, he told her reassuringly. But Miss Hardy was not convinced. At least in an automobile, she sighed, you can get out and walk if the motor stops. Shaking her head, she left the study. By the way, said Mr. Hardy, a fellow from the Bayport Control Tower delivered a small package for you boys this morning. He extracted a set of keys from his pocket, unlocked his desk drawer, and took out the package. Frank eagerly opened it while Joe went to fetch their tape recorder. This, Frank explained, is the tape containing the conversation between the control tower and someone who sounds like Clint Hill. I thought if we listened to the recording several times, we might be able to identify the ghost with one of our suspects. At that moment, a stout, cheerful-looking boy strolled into the study. Hi, Chet, the Hardys grinned at their new arrival. Good-natured Chet Morton was one of Frank and Joe's best pals. Although comfort-loving, and not fond of danger, he was loyal and had often helped the brothers in solving mysteries. Hi, everyone, Chet responded. Spotting the tray of refreshments, he eyed them hungrily. You're just in time for a little snack, said Frank, chuckling. Their friend's large appetite was well known to all. Thanks. I thought I'd stop by and see what you and Joe are up to. Just then, Joe returned with the recorder. Frank put the tape on the machine and snapped the start switch. Seconds later, a ghostly voice issued from the speaker. What is that? Queried Chet with a look of genuine astonishment. You're listening to a ghost, Joe grinned. Ghost? Chet replied scornfully. That caterwauling wouldn't even scare a nervous cat. They played the tape several times. Chet tried to imitate the eerie voice. The dead can tell no tales, said the tape. The dead can tell no tales, Chet repeated. That's a pretty good imitation, Frank laughed. Maybe you can get work haunting houses. The Hardys listened to the tape a few more times, but were unable to associate the ghost with any of the suspects they had encountered. Chet, who by now had consumed most of the brownies, glanced at his watch and announced it was time for him to go home. As he left the study, the boys were amused to hear him mumbling, "The dead can tell no tales." The next morning, Frank and Joe drove to the Stanwide Mining Equipment Company. Mr. Allen welcomed them with a smile as they entered his office. "How has the case been coming?" he asked. "Have you managed to uncover any clues?" "We haven't found much to go on," Frank said regretfully. The boys told them about their visit to Stanwide hangar and described all that had happened during their masquerade as employees. Mr. Allen expressed deep concern over their narrow escape in the warehouse. The Hardys said they were certain that somehow information had leaked out as to their real reason for working in the plant. He agreed that it might be too dangerous for them to continue their undercover work there. "I'm disturbed to hear about Art Rodak's conduct," Mr. Allen declared. "I won't have a man of his character working for my company." "I suggest you say nothing to him," Frank urged. "Every one of your employees is a suspect at present. If Rodak is fired, it may spoil our chances of getting to the bottom of the platinum thefts." Frank also pointed out that it would be unwise for Joe and himself to resign suddenly from their jobs. This might make it appear that their investigation had uncovered some clues and would put whoever was involved in the thefts doubly on guard. "Then what will you do?" Mr. Allen asked. "We'll get ourselves fired," said Frank. "How?" his brother questioned. "From the beginning, Rodak has resented our being hired," Frank said. "Maybe it's because he's mixed up in the racket and he knows about us. Anyhow, I'm willing to bet he wouldn't need much of an excuse to fire us." Frank glanced at his wristwatch. "You know how fussy he is about having us report for work 20 minutes early. Well, we're now nearly an hour late. That should do it." After telling Mr. Allen that they would keep him posted on any new developments in the case, the young detectives went off to the messenger department. When they came face to face with Rodak, Frank could see that his plan was working out even better than he expected. "Do you know what time it is?" shouted Rodak. Although he seemed furious, the boys could sense that he was actually pleased with the situation. "We couldn't get here any earlier," said Joe. "You won't have to worry about that any more," Rodak bellowed. "You're fired." The boys pretended to be angry and concerned. "We'll report this to the main office," Frank blazed. "Go ahead," Rodak yelled. "See how far that'll get you." He turned and stalked off with a self-satisfied air. The boys left the factory and started for the airfield. On the way, they discussed Rodak briefly. "I wonder how pleased old Sour Face would be," Joe remarked, "if he realized he played right into our hands." A few minutes later, the Hardys were walking towards a small frame building. A sign reading Ace Air Service spanned its entire width along the roof. Another smaller sign, Office and Operations, hung above the doorway. On the aircraft parking ramp, the boys saw 3 single-engine and 2 multi-engine aircrafts bearing the firm's name. As they entered the building, a voice called to them, "Frank and Joe Hardy." The boys turned to see a tall, lean man walking towards them. He wore a tan cloth jacket and sunglasses with green-tinted lenses. He extended his hand in greeting. "I'm Randy Watson," he said. "I fly for Ace Air Service. I have the plane all set." The pilot added he had often flown their father on trips. "I've heard a lot about you fellas," he added, smiling. "Are you on a case or just going on a sightseeing trip?" Before answering, Frank walked over to a large aeronautical chart attached to the wall. With his finger, he circled an area colored in shades of light green and brown northwest of Bayport. We want to take some aerial photographs in this locale, he said. Joe and I are sure we spotted an ex-convict there. We're curious to know what he's up to. Randy stepped close to the chart and estimated the distance between Bayport and the area Frank had indicated. That's not far by air, he observed. We can use one of the single-engine ships. We'd like to reach the area about noon, said Frank. The pilot checked his wristwatch. That means we'll have to take off within the next 10 or 15 minutes. Joe hurried to the airport restaurant to order sandwiches and milk for their lunch, while Frank returned to the brothers' car to pick up the aerial camera and films. The boys reached the flight line just as Randy was completing a pre-flight check of the aircraft. In a few minutes, they were strapped in their seats and taxiing towards the active runway. The pilot remarked, "Because of the direction of the wind, that runway is the only one I can use to head the plane into the wind." He turned his radio to the proper frequency and contacted Bayport Tower. An immediate reply crackled from the pilot's receiver. Ace Service Flight 26 is cleared to runway 19er. Winds from the southeast at 15 knots. Altimeter setting 2986. Randy paused to check his instruments, controls, and engine magnetos. The tower then cleared him for immediate takeoff. Turning into the runway, he eased the throttle ahead. Soon, he and his passengers were airborne and taking a course to the northwest. The boys gazed down at the earth below. The terrain became more hilly with each passing mile. The expanses of wooded areas looked like rumpled deep green carpet. Here and there, lakes and small streams reflected the sun in bright flashes, almost blinding in their intensity. The pilot adjusted his course, checking his watch against the small clock mounted on the instrument panel. Then he said to Frank and Joe, "We should be coming up on the area you're looking for in a few minutes." The Hardy scanned the surface below more intently. Far to the left, Frank saw a narrow ribbon of pavement that he surmised to be the highway from which he and Joe had turned onto the secondary road. Frank requested the pilot to fly closer to the highway. "There it is," declared Joe. "That must be the secondary road we drove along." Frank peered directly downward. The road itself was not visible, but a telltale cleft that snaked among the trees told him it was there. Randy banked steeply to the right and paralleled the road. "Can we fly lower?" Frank asked. Randy examined the terrain. "It seems to be pretty desolate. I think we can drop to a lower altitude without breaking any regulations." The pilot eased back on the power and allowed the nose of the airplane to drop a few degrees below horizontal. The large hand of the altimeter slowly moved counterclockwise, indicating a descent. Randy leveled out at about 500 feet, skillfully avoiding the hills. The cleft in the trees grew wider, bringing the road into view. "Look!" Joe yelled. "That's where our car turned over. The saplings we used for leverage are still there." "Start taking pictures," Frank ordered. "I'll keep an eye out for anything of special interest." Joe gripped the camera and pointed it downward. Randy banked the plane so the young detectives could take more direct aim. Joe made several exposures as the pilot circled the area, gradually widening his turn. "I just spotted something," Frank shouted. "What is it?" Joe readied the camera. "It looks like the roof of a small cabin," Frank replied. "If the sun weren't directly overhead, it would be hidden in the shadows. It's surrounded by trees and brush." "I see it!" exclaimed Joe. He focused the camera and released the shutter. "The cabin is near the spot where we saw Bush Barney," Frank declared. "Do you think he could be hiding out there?" Joe questioned. "It's possible, and perhaps our friend with the shotgun, too." The pilot rolled out of the turn. "We'll fly straight and level for a few seconds," he said. "If we continue those tight turns for too long, we might get vertigo." Their straight course took them over an area on the opposite side of the road. Frank suddenly noticed a rectangular-shaped field that looked like a pasture. "Fly over that way," he said to Randy, pointing almost directly ahead. The pilot eased the plane into a course around the narrow clearing. Frank and Joe saw that the grassy field was bordered by trees, and the dense brushwood at one end loomed a high, steep hill. "What do you make of it?" Frank asked, glancing at the pilot. "Do you think a small plane could land there and take off?" "I doubt it," Randy said, "but let's go down for a closer look." He dropped the plane's nose steeply, pulling out over the clearing below tree level. He carefully dragged the field, then applied full power and turned sharply away from the steep hill ahead. "That clearing is only about 900 feet long," he told the boys. "The approaches are very bad. I doubt whether anyone could get a plane in there without rolling it into a ball. And even if a landing were possible, he'd never be able to take off again." The boys' thoughts turned back to the airplane they had encountered on the road. If it had crashed, where was the wreckage? It must have pulled up and gone off. Did the roadblock and the red flare have something to do with the maneuver? Frank took over with the camera. Quickly reloading it, he photographed the open area. Joe peered through his binoculars. Suddenly he snapped up in his seat. "Down in the clearing," he shouted. "See those two men stalking along the edge?" The pilot banked the plane and lined up for another low pass. As they approached, Frank also spotted the two figures. Joe focused his binoculars more sharply. "I'm not sure," he yelled excitedly, "but I think one of those men is Bush Barney." As the plane roared closer, the two men whirled around. They glanced up and then turned and ran into the woods. "Quick!" Frank shouted to Randy. "Pull around and make another low pass." The pilot again pulled up steeply to turn away from the hill ahead. But just as he pushed the throttle forward for more power, the engine suddenly sputtered, then quit completely. Randy immediately dropped the nose in an effort to keep flying speed and avoid a stall. The boys looked ahead. Through the windshield, all they could see was a formidable array of trees, dense brush, and hills strewn with rocks and boulders. They tightened their seatbelts and braced themselves for the worst. There was no place to land. They would have to crash. And that is the end of chapter 6. Join me tomorrow for chapter 7.